Okay. Hello, Mom. Um, we're in Worm, Arc 1, Chapter 5, and Taylor has just pepper sprayed the horrible supervillain Lung in his one remaining, vulnerable eye. Here we go. It had been vain to hope that he would slip and fall. I just counted myself lucky that however metallic his face looked, there were still parts of it vulnerable to the spray. Lung hauled himself over the edge of the roof. I had him hurting, I just couldn't do anything about it. My bugs were officially useless, there was nothing left in my utility sheath, and I would hurt myself more than I hurt Lung if I attacked him. Making a mental note to pick myself up a concealable knife or baton if I managed to live through this, I bolted for the fire escape. Motherfucker! Lung screamed. With my back turned, there was no way to see it, but the roof was briefly illuminated before the wave of flame hit me from behind. Knocked off balance, I skidded on the gravel and hit the raised lip of the roof just by the fire escape. Frantically, I patted myself down. My costume wasn't on fire, but my hair, I hurriedly ran my hands over it to make sure it hadn't been ignited. Small mercies, I thought, that there was no tar used on this roof. I could just imagine the flames igniting the rooftop and just how little I'd be able to do if it happened. Lung stood slowly, still covering part of his face with his hand. He walked with a slight limp as he approached me. Blindly, he lashed out with a broad wave of flame that rolled over half the roof. I covered my head with my hands and brought my knees to my chest as the hot air and flame rushed over me. My costume seemed to take the brunt of it, but it was still hot enough I had to bite my lip to stop from making a sound. Lung stopped advancing, slowly turning his head from one side to another. "Cocksucker," he growled in his heavily accented voice, his cussing interrupted by his panting for breath. "Move. Give me something to aim for." I held my breath and stayed as still as possible. What could I do? I still had the pepper spray in my hand, but even if I got him again, I was running the risk that he would lash out and bake me alive before I could move. If I moved first, he would hear me, and I would get knocked around by another blast of flame, probably before I could get to my feet. Lung moved his hand from his face. He blinked a few times, then looked around, then blinked a few more. It was a matter of seconds before he could see well enough to make me out from the shadows. Wasn't pepper spray supposed to put someone down for 30 minutes? How was this monster not an A-lister? He suddenly moved, flames wreathing his hands, and I screwed my eyes shut. When I heard the crackling whoosh of the flame and wasn't burned alive, I opened my eyes again. Lung was firing streams of flame, aiming for the edge of the roof of the adjacent building, a 3-story apartment. I looked to see what he was aiming at, but couldn't make anything out in the gloom or in the brief second of light Lung's flames afforded. With no warning, a massive shape landed atop Lung with an impact I could swear people heard at the other end of the street. The size of a van, the massive object was animal rather than vehicle, resembling a cross between a lizard and a tiger with tangles of muscle and bone where it ought to have skin, scales, or fur. Lung was now on his knees, holding one of the beast's sizable claws away from his face with his own clawed hand. Lung used his free hand to strike the creature across the snout. Even though he was smaller than the beast, the impact made it rear back. It took a few short steps back in reaction, then Rhino charged him off the edge of the roof. They hit the street with an audible crash. I stood, aware I was shaking like a leaf. I was so unsteady on my feet from the mixed relief and fear that I almost fell over again as 2 more impacts shook the roof. 2 more creatures, similar to the first in texture but slightly different in size and shape, had arrived on the rooftop. These 2 each had a pair of riders. I watched as the people slid off the backs of the animals. There were 2 girls, a guy, and a 4th I identified as male only because of the height. The tall one approached me, while the others hurried to the edge of the roof to watch Lung and the creature duke it out. "You really saved us a lot of trouble," he told me. His voice was deep, masculine, but muffled by the helmet he wore. He was dressed entirely in black, a costume I realized was basically motorcycle leathers and a motorcycle helmet. The only thing that made me think it was a costume was the visor of his helmet. The full-face visor was sculpted to look like a stylized skull, and was as black as the rest of his costume, with only the faint highlights of reflected light on the surface to give a sense of what it was. It was one of those costumes that people put together out of what they can scrounge up, and it wasn't half bad if you didn't look too close. He reached out a hand towards me, and I leaned away, wary. I didn't know what to say, so I stuck to my policy of not saying anything that could get me into a worse situation. Withdrawing his hand, the man in black jerked his thumb over one shoulder. "When we got word Lung was aiming to come after us tonight, we were pretty freaked. We were arguing strategy for the better part of the day. We eventually decided, fuck it, we'd meet him halfway, wing it. Not my usual way of doing things, but yeah." Behind him, one of the girls whistled sharply and pointed down at the street. The two monsters the group had been riding on bounded across the roof and leaped down to the street to join the fight. The guy in black kept talking. Wouldn't you know, his flunky Lee is there, with half a dozen guys, but Lung and the rest of his gang are nowhere to be found. He laughed, a surprisingly normal sound for someone wearing a mask with a skull on it. Lee is no slouch in a fight, but there's a reason he's not the leader of the ABB. He got spooked without his boss there and ran. I guess you're responsible for that? Skull Mask waited for a response from me. When I didn't offer one, he ventured towards the edge of the roof and looked down, then spoke without turning to look at me. Lung is getting creamed. The fuck you do to him?
Pepper spray, wasp and bee stings, fire ants, and spider bites,
the second of the girls said, answering the question for me. She was dressed in a skin-tight outfit that combined black with a pale shade of blue or purple. I couldn't tell in the dark, and her dark blonde hair was long and windblown. The girl grinned as she added,
He's not holding up too well. Gonna feel a hell of a lot worse tomorrow.
The man in black suddenly turned to look at me. Introductions. That's Tattletale. I'm Gru. The girl with the dogs. He pointed to the other girl, the one who had whistled and directed the monsters. She wasn't in costume, unless I counted a plaid skirt, army boots, a torn-up sleeveless t-shirt, and a hard, plastic, dollar store Rottweiler mask as a costume. We call her Bitch, her preference. But in the interest of being PG, the good guys in the media decided to call her Hellhound instead. Last and certainly least, we have a Regent. I finally caught up with what he was saying. Those monsters were dogs? Fuck you, Gru. Regent retorted with a chuckle and a tone of voice that made it clear he wasn't really that offended. He was wearing a white mask, not quite as decorative or made up as the ones I associated with the carnivals of Venice, but similar. He'd placed a silver coronet around his short black curls and wore a ruffled white shirt with skin-tight leggings tucked into knee-high boots. The outfit was very Renaissance fair. He had a build that made me think more of a dancer than a bodybuilder. Introductions done, Gru looked at me for several long moments. After a few seconds, he asked me, You okay? You hurt?
The reason she's not introducing herself isn't because she's hurt,
Tattletale told him as she continued to lean over the edge of the roof and watch whatever was going on at street level.
It's because she's shy.
Tattletale turned around, and it looked like she was going to say something else, but she stopped, turning her head. The smile she'd been wearing faded.
Heads up. We gotta scram.
Bitch nodded in response and whistled, one short whistle followed by two long ones. After a brief pause, the building was suddenly rattled by impacts. In just moments, the three creatures of hers leaped from the alleys to either side of the building and onto the roof. Gru turned towards me. I was still standing on the opposite end of the roof by the fire escape. Hey, wanna ride? I looked at the creatures. Dogs? They were bloodied, snarling creatures out of a nightmare. I shook my head. He shrugged. Hey, Tattletale said to me, seating herself just behind Bitch.
What's your name?
I stared at her. My voice caught in my throat before I was able to get the words out. I haven't picked one yet.
Well, Bug, a cave is gonna show up in less than a minute. You did us a solid by dealing with Lung, so take my advice. Someone from the Protectorate shows up? Finds two bad guys duking it out, they're not gonna let one walk away. You should get out of here, she said. She flashed me a smile. She had one of those vulpine grins that turned up at the corners. Behind her simple black domino-style mask, her eyes were glittering with mischief. If she had red hair, she would have made me think of a fox. She kind of did, anyways. With that, they leaped over my head, one of the three beasts hitting or stepping on the fire escape on the way down, eliciting a screech of metal on metal. When I realized what had just happened, I could have cried. It was easy enough to pin down Regent, Tattletale, and Bitch as teenagers. It wasn't much of an intuitive leap to guess that Gru had been one too. The children Lung had mentioned, the ones I'd gone to so much effort to save tonight, were bad guys. Not only that, but they had mistaken me for one too. So we move on to chapter 6.